new research report has just dropped, and the findings shed light on how the Chinese government seeks to influence coverage of its development projects in the Philippines. An earlier research report found that Chinese development funding in the Philippines between the years 2000 and 2022 reached an unusually high total of $9.1 billion. Why is Beijing committing development funds to the Philippines? And how is it trying to shape Philippine public opinion about all this money? Hi, I'm John Nery, and you are in the Public Square. The September 2024 report, Investing in Narratives, and the earlier June 2024 report, Beijing's Big Bet, were produced and published by AidData, a research lab at William & Mary, a leading public research university in the United States. Joining us today is the lead author of the June report and an editor of the September study. Samantha Custer is Director of Policy Analysis of AidData. She also teaches at the Whole of Government Center of Excellence in William & Mary. Welcome, Samantha, and thank you for joining us in the Public Square.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Samantha, let me start by asking you, your report, the second report, the September 2024 report, identified three narratives or main messages that China was promoting as far as their development projects in the Philippines are concerned. Can you talk more about these three narratives?
Sure. So if you look at Beijing's positioning in its preferred stories, you see three narratives. One is this idea of win-win cooperation.
The win-win?
Win-win. This is good for you. This is good for me. It's good for everybody. This is something that Beijing is doing to try to set itself apart from what it refers to as Western development partners that are seen as dictating terms to another country, whereas Beijing is trying to say, we're on the same playing field. This is good for both of us. A second major theme is this idea of China's inevitable rise.
Okay, inevitable.
So you want to be part of the story. You want to be part of the right team, the winning team. It's inevitable, so don't resist it. Be part of this winning coalition, this economic partnership. And then the third theme is this idea of Asia for Asians. This idea that China is essentially a power that is in Asia, that it has the credibility and the positioning to be able to speak into other Asian economies with higher legitimacy than other powers that are farther away.
I'm curious, has AidData ever had the chance to study other areas and also the Chinese main messages in those areas? I'm curious, for instance, about Asia for Asians. I mean, that won't translate in Africa, for instance, where China is heavily in, right? Have you had a chance to compare?
Absolutely, yes, we have looked at this. Certainly throughout other parts of Asia, you do see similar messages, but if you go to places like Africa, for example, it's a slightly different spin. So this idea that, for Africans, they're often seen as being talked down to by a US or a UK or the EU. China is a developing nation in and of itself. It understands. It's been part of that process of breaking out of poverty. And so China is positioning itself not as a colonial power or a neo-colonial power, but as something different, something that's more approachable.
What about in Southeast Asia? Essentially, it's the same cocktail of the three messages, but
it's a very similar set of messages for certain. And I think, it speaks to this idea of China really wants to position itself as the regional economic and security partner of choice and push out some of these other competitors that it sees as crowding into its space.
These main messages you're able to identify by looking at what the Chinese official state media were doing, right? Xinhua, People's Daily, China Daily, and so on. I was struck by something in the report that said that in 2019, so 5 years ago, it was already a matter of record that of the many millions of viewers these Chinese state media websites had, 15.1 came from the Philippines. So can you talk more about that? I thought that was a startling statistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you take a step back from that statistic for a moment and put it in a context, these digital technologies, the fact that you're seeing increased connectivity on the internet, the proliferation of smartphones, it has democratized the way that people access information and the way that people can push out information.
Right.
And that unlocks huge opportunities for China to be able to reduce the cost and the friction to reach people in the Philippines. And so the fact that Filipinos are so highly connected online is a huge advantage. Now, the challenge for Beijing, though, is a lot of its state-owned media are still seen as suspect because of the tight media controls in China. It's not like in the Philippines where there's much more of a plurality of different voices or freedom of the media. In China, a lot of this is dictated by the state. And so even if you have the channels to be able to reach Filipino users and viewers, there's still some limitations for China.
So I was struck by that there's a considerable number of Filipinos who are already accessing, as of 2019, official or direct channels, as you phrase them in your report. What about indirect channels for China in the Philippines? Here we're talking of Philippine publications or websites or networks. Can we talk more about that? Is it the same mix of the three messages now being directed at these indirect channels, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. I think, as I said before, there's a limitation for China when it uses its own channels. There's a certain degree to which that seems suspect. And so you can borrow the credibility of local Philippine media if you pursue these partnerships. So there are a few different ways that we see this happening. One is this idea of content sharing partnerships.
All right.
So let's say you're a Xinhua or China Radio International. And you're producing lots of content that really reflect your preferred narratives. You can get so far with Filipino viewers accessing your content online. But what if you could partner with a local Filipino outlet?
Right.
This Philippine outlet has ready-made consumers, networks, it has local credibility. No one's saying it's a propaganda arm for the Chinese Communist Party. So let's say you could have a partnership with this outlet and say you can republish, share, co-create our content via your local media, and you don't even have to disclose where the content came from. So that could mean that you today in Manila are picking up a Manila Times article that could have come from Xinhua or a Chinese state-run media outlet, and you don't know. So content sharing partnerships is one important way. Another is journalist trainings. So, the opportunity for journalists in the Philippines to improve their reporting skills, their knowledge of the space, their professionalism. In an ideal world, training is a wonderful thing. But there's also an opportunity for China through these training opportunities, bring journalists to China, wine and dine them, to take them around to see exciting places. And the hope is that this creates a more sympathetic outlook towards China, towards its development approach. And then the final area is this idea of social media. We talked about this a little bit earlier. In addition to these Chinese state-run media outlets having their own social media channels, they're also interested in cultivating local influencers here in the Philippines on social media. Now, I'll say that all of these different channels, they've been successful to a point, but they too are limited.
Let's backtrack, right? So the three indirect methods that you found, CSPs or content sharing partnerships, journalist trainings for some members of the Philippine media, and then third is working with social media influencers, right? Let's talk about content sharing partnerships. I found this section of the report to be the most eye-opening, right? So, full disclosure, I used to serve as editor-in-chief of Inquire.net, which is featured here. So this was well before the content sharing part. I did not know that there is a CSP. But there are other newspapers with a CSP, Manila Times being one of them, some Chinese language newspapers in the Philippines as well. Do we know if these CSPs the newspapers pay for them, for the privilege of running them, or like what's the economics of CSPs?
So content sharing partnerships operate differently than sponsored content.
Okay.
So if it's a question of sponsored content, it's basically the Chinese government buying an ad in a local newspaper or running a circular or something that is specifically their content that they're trying to push out. Those are things that the Chinese government is paying advertising revenue to a local outlet. Content sharing partnerships are different. Content sharing partnerships are about giving access for local journalists to a pool of content that is being produced by Chinese state-run media for free. In some cases, there are examples of co-created content where both outlets are pooling resources together to do this. But really, it's about free access to content. And if you think about it, for journalists all over the world, you're talking about scarce resources to be able to produce compelling stories. So I can understand the appeal of having access to this vast pool of resources at your disposal.
Right. It's free content, essentially, right?
Exactly.
Essentially, yeah. Later we'll talk about are any of these methods working, right? Let's go to the second indirect method. So journalist training. Again, full disclosure, when Beijing was trying to whet appetite for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. I went there together with other Filipino journalists, spent a few days there. So I've seen the iconic Xinhua news agency headquarters, for instance, right? But we were only there for a couple of hours. Do we have any idea how many Filipino journalists have been trained by China? I want to make sure nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? I mean, Filipino journalists train in the U.S., or in the UK or elsewhere. Do we have some idea of the scope of this second method?
I wish that we could, and this is actually one of the most challenging to be able to track and quantify. I think we did some work in the second report that was released in September to do a comb of media articles that reference some of these trainings. And the thing is that's interesting, so I don't have a number of people trained, but what I can say is there's no one training. They all take different forms. Sometimes it's Filipino journalists alongside any number of different countries. So they're bringing countries together for shared training. In other instances, it's more targeted to a small cadre of Filipino journalists. And the focus of these things can be various. Sometimes it's about broadcasting the Belt and Road Initiative and to showcase the value of China's contributions. Other times it's showcasing China's own development domestically to demonstrate why this is a model worth replicating. But yeah, I agree with you. There's nothing wrong with participating in a journalist training from China. I think with all of these methods, the question is just exposing that to the light of day and making sure that we're really cognizant of the potential for influencing the narrative.
I think it's worth pointing out that many of us realized that there was a major attempt to train Filipino journalists working for government media during the Duterte years, under then Presidential Communications Operations Secretary Martin Andanar, who is now an anchor on Chinese TV. So yeah, maybe that's one alternative future.
That's also an example of the power of this tool in creating networks and relationships. And then you think about the power of that in influencing and shaping how you think about covering a news story or whether you're going to cover it at all. Especially because you do have this movement from a Filipino journalist working for Philippine media and then moving over to Chinese media.
For the third method of working with social media influencers, my understanding of the section was that it's very much a limited win. I mean, the results as they stand not very encouraging for Beijing. Can you walk us through this?
Yeah, I think the challenge with doing the social media influencer tool well is you have to have a very in-depth understanding of the cultural context. who are the right influencers. And then you have to have a message that's going to resonate with local audiences. And I think that Beijing has struggled on both counts to get the message right and to find the right influencers that are willing to work with them. Now, I don't think we should count them out on this. One of the things that is clear to me that when China began doing things like educational exchange, study abroad opportunities, initially in the first few years, those were viewed as fairly rough-hewn methods.
Sure.
China wasn't very good at it. There was more supply of opportunities rather than demand. That's not necessarily the case today. They have definitely professionalized this particular tool. So I would say, yes, to date on social media influencer as a tactic, fairly limited, but let's watch and see.
Sure. Some of our audience members right now might be, screaming at the screen and saying, "What do you mean? There's so many Chinese trolls on Philippine social media?" But I think, if I understand it correctly and the report correctly, we are focused on the use of social influencers to promote the development projects, right? So as far as that is concerned, we're not talking about political dynasties or political objectives. We're talking about specific specific development projects, and the use of social media influencers, not so good yet.
Exactly, and I think what you're saying, John, points out another tool that we don't talk as much about in the report because it's not as frequently used in the context of development projects. But this idea of social media trolls or what we call inauthentic amplification, which basically is the use of false front accounts. Zombie accounts, essentially, on social media that, a state-run media outlet can use to amplify its message artificially. So you don't have all of these real-world users. They're fake users, and they're promoting your content because it's an algorithm. And so the things that get shared the most get seen the most. That China does very well. And there were, some estimates point to about 10,000 of these false front accounts that are active. So that's definitely an easier tactic for China to deploy. Authentic Filipino influencers and cultivating them, that's been a little bit more difficult.
We're going to return to this the second report, the September 2024 report. I have a few more questions about media influence.
Please.
But I want to get to that earlier question about whether any of this is effective. And I think for us to answer that, we'll have to take a look at the earlier report, right? So Beijing's big bet, decoding 2 decades of Chinese development funding in the Philippines. So there's an amazing statistic. In 20 years, $9.1 billion. Second only to Japan, which has traditionally been, since 1966, our largest source of official development aid and loans. What struck me was that it seems to be dictated in part by political dynamics. So it started under Gloria Arroyo. Of course, now when you look at it, we're talking about small sums, but relative to where it was coming from, it was a big jump. And then it fell under Noynoy Aquino, and then in 2016, it went up under Duterte. Can you walk us through your findings of the June 2024 report?
Sure. So $9.1 billion, that's a lot of money, but it wasn't even throughout the period.
Okay.
For sure. It's definitely an indication of the bilateral relationship between Manila and Beijing was important in influencing the volume of funds. And some of this is reflective of the fact that the way that China orients its development finance dollars is it sources project ideas directly from senior political leaders. So when you have a leader like Arroyo in power or Duterte, both had fairly prominent infrastructure-led growth initiatives. They were both looking for partners that were willing to invest heavily in infrastructure. And China was one of the actors that was willing to come to the table. And so it makes sense that you have a sympathetic political leader in office that has an interest in infrastructure that requires capital at a scale that most development partners, they can't even dream of. that fueled a lot of growth. So in the Arroyo administration era, you saw a 950% increase in new financing from Beijing. And then under Duterte, that's where the biggest surge of financing overall came about. And the fastest approval of new projects. Then I think what you see happening when you have a less sympathetic leader in power, like this was the case with Aquino in particular, he was concerned, if you think about it as a pendulum swing, Arroyo very pro-China, then it shifted to Aquino, very concerned about it. China didn't go away. It just changed its tactics. So it went from an emphasis on government-to-government related projects to investing substantially in the Philippine private sector. So you saw that as an open opportunity. And then when Duterte came back in power, the door was open again. I think the interesting question now is with the Marcos Jr. administration.
It's a big question mark.
It's a big question mark. Marcos Jr. has indicated that he's concerned about the high level of economic interdependence, dependence on China that came about under Duterte, wants to course correct, is starting to diversify his relationships. So, we could be seeing a shift again from Beijing. They're not going away, but they'll probably reinvest more in the private sector.
Just a quick comparative question. The aid or development financing from Japan, does it go through the same kind of political roller coaster?
That's a good question. I think, certainly Japan was ahead of the game in the early 2000s. But I think that was partly because you didn't see the surge yet from China. I think Japan's level of investment has actually stayed relatively steady. But if Japan was here, China began here and then all of a sudden started surpassing it. So I think that's what you see happening. Japan tends to operate a little bit more like a traditional donor in some respects. So there are two types of assistance. There's aid, which are grants or no or low interest loans, relatively cheap to access these funds, and then debt. Which actually operates a little bit more like commercial lending if you went to the private sector capital markets. Japan,
and as it turns out, 90-something% of the $9.1 billion from China is debt, not grant.
That's right, 94%.
94%.
Yes, that's right. And that is very unusual. If you compare that to Japan, both Japan and China love infrastructure. They put a lot of money in infrastructure. Both give loans. They don't typically give grants. The difference is in the terms. So the loans that Japan offers are usually come with a very generous interest rate. So we're talking about less than 1%. They have very gracious repayment periods. They want to make it easy to repay. China's loans expect an economic return. They operate more like a banker than a benefactor in this respect. And so there are some real differences there.
Is there an economic rationale for accepting China's terms? Assuming
on the part of the Philippines.
On the part of the Philippines. Assuming that there is a comparable offer from Japan or another donor country.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because if you look at the, you have two offers on the table, and one says, 4% interest rate, pay us back in 10 years, versus 1% interest rate, pay us back in 20. You'd think that the latter offer would be more attractive, but you're absolutely right. There are other considerations. One is that China is known for adding sweeteners to these deals. So yes, you get this loan for an infrastructure project, but do you get access to export markets for your goods and commodities that you wouldn't have had? Or China is known for tightly controlling which countries get to receive group tours from China. So tourism flows are a major revenue source potential. And so, it's not just the prospect of this loan, but it's the prospect of closer economic partnership with China. So that's one economic rationale. The other, and that's a positive rationale. The negative rationale is that the way that China designs this financing, there's many loopholes that create perverse incentives for collusion and corruption, because the whole process is more opaque. there's less competition. And so it's easy for a local official or a local Filipino firm, to agree to collude with a Chinese counterpart and split the proceeds. So there's the more positive reason why you might choose China's offer, but there's also a more negative one.
At the Ateneo School of Government forum that we were both in, I remember hearing a scholar say that for many lay Filipinos, Chinese development funding can be summed up as, well, there were 2 land bridges built. Right? And yet, there's actually $9.1 billion, of course, going all the way back to the year 2000. Should we be surprised that there's this big discrepancy between what many people might think and then the reality? There's billions of dollars invested in energy, in what are the top 3? In transport, and in
telecommunications.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, I'll go back to the second study for just a moment. One of the things that was interesting, so we looked at, I think it was 8 different Philippine outlets.
Okay, all right.
Looked at their coverage over a period of years. 97% of the coverage was related to broader China-Philippine relations.
That's right.
Only 3% of the coverage had anything to do with these development projects, which is striking given how much money we're talking about. This is $9.1 billion and barely makes a dent in local media coverage. So I think it's unsurprising to me then that there's a gap between the average Filipino's perspective and the amount of money we're seeing here. I think the second thing is that, so there's a difference between the number of projects and the amount of money. So $9.1 billion in money, over 200 different projects. Most of those projects are small dollar goodwill projects. So they are, I'm donating books to your local school. I'm giving masks to this local clinic. Those are very nice to have things, but there's fairly small visibility there, fairly small reach. That's most of the projects we're talking about here. But there are a few projects, these big ticket infrastructure projects, and we're talking about the dams, the roads, the bridges, the railways, that consume most of the money. And that is the thing that is striking to me. These things, in theory, should be very visible for in the eyes of the Philippine public, but they're not coming out in the media coverage. It's seldom what people are thinking about when they think of China. It's much more likely that they're thinking about the disputes in the South China Sea than they are about these development projects.
Yeah, so that brings us back to that question of impact. Does it work? So not only the indirect methods, including content sharing partnership, but even the direct channels. So it's important to note, as we've said earlier, already in 2019, there were 15 million Filipinos accessing Chinese websites. But it's also important to note that there are Chinese state media present in the Philippines, right? You have a table that identifies which has a bureau in Manila and that sort of thing. So you have the direct channels in China, you have the direct channels presence in the Philippines, and then you have the indirect channels. And yet, which I think in a period of 6 years, you identified as publishing, I don't know, total of hundreds of thousands of articles, right? Like one had like 11,000 articles and so on. And only like a few hundreds, like 3%, was the average, right? Were about People's Republic of China projects. Right. I mean, it's hard to reach a conclusion that it's not working.
Yeah. I mean, that is, or this is just not an area of focus for the Philippine media. What I will say, let's look first at the 3%.
Okay.
So in the 3%, there is an aspect that tells us this isn't working for Beijing. And the reason I say that is, when Philippine media are talking about Chinese development projects, they are willing to talk about the things that aren't working. The projects that are problem projects, the cost overruns, the issues with corruption, the contractual disputes, the displacement, the delays, the displacement of local people, environmental impacts. So these stories are being told. And what's striking is that these stories are being told even among media outlets that have those content sharing partnerships.
Okay.
And that's a good indication that, just having a content sharing partnership doesn't mean that all of your coverage is going to be pro-China. So there are some aspects to this that say, okay, this isn't entirely working. But remember that 3% of coverage isn't all that much.
That's right.
Now, if you look at the overall tone of media during this period, it tends to be quite negative towards Beijing on average. If you look at different outlets' practices, there are some that are a little bit more positive towards Beijing. Let's say if you look at op-eds that are being posted in the Manila Times, for example, this was one of the examples that was the most positive consistently towards Beijing in 71% of the quarters that were covered. Is that because of the content sharing partnership? We don't know. But, it could be part of the story there. But I think that, what's clear to me is, Beijing can, when it's working through these indirect channels, it can't have as much control over the message as it wants. But I think you need to look at not only the sentiment of the message, but also what is being covered. And I do think that there is an element here because China tries to profile the successes of its projects, it underplays those challenges. So, it remains to be seen where this goes in future.
Is there comparative research that can tell us, like, for instance, in Thailand, more stories are written about the projects and fewer stories that are written are about the delays and so on? Or is it just specific to the Philippines?
So we haven't looked at that question in other countries. But what I will say is that often, there is a sense that, when these stories in the Philippines are being written, it's usually in the middle of a controversy. So I think that's often the dynamics. You saw a lot of uptick of North Rail stories, for example, the troubled project that was ultimately canceled when, the Supreme Court decision was coming out over whether this project would continue or not. So I think it's very episodic. It happens when there's some big event or some big problem related to a project. That's when you get some media coverage, and then it just goes out of sight, out of mind.
Is there a pattern that you see that will link indirect channels, media coverage, and the distribution of the development funds? I think that you found out in the earlier report that the number one source, the number one area for receiving the development funds is Central Luzon, followed by the National Capital Region, and then, to my surprise, because I come from Northern Mindanao, Northern Mindanao comes third. Do we see these priorities reflected in some sort of media coverage pattern? Do you see that? Or?
It's a good question. I think where you see a lot of the content sharing partnerships, they're based in the National Capital Region. It's not exclusively so, but that's where it's dominant. No, we haven't looked at the distribution of the geography of this to be sure.
Well, I think part of if I remember correctly, it's coming back to me now. But if I remember correctly, the data on the 8 newspapers that you surveyed, the highest number was 4%, and that was Business World, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's because that's the beat of Business World. You're talking about economic projects, right? That's business opportunities and so on. So maybe there's a reason for that. I say this as a political journalist of over 25 years. We also have too much of a focus on politics in Philippine media. We have very few, we do have, but there are not that many good economic reporters who can talk about, the implications of a particular investment, for instance. So maybe it's also possible that, so I'm just trying to see what other possibilities there are. Maybe it's also possible that we don't have enough resources to actually fully appreciate what's out there.
Well, I agree with that, especially because this is one of the unique challenges with China's development finance is its level of opacity. So, if you take an actor like an Australia, a US, a World Bank, they participate in international reporting regimes that basically means we are reporting on all of the development projects, the terms, the results. China is not party to these same standards, and it makes it very difficult to be able to know how much money is being committed, how are firms being vetted. It's particularly problematic because many of the firms that implement these projects have been sanctioned for questionable financial practices. And so all of this makes it very difficult. So if journalists wanted to do a story to try to understand what's happening in these projects, it would be very difficult to do. And actually, that's one of the reasons why we produce this research in this, in the first place, is how do you put a spotlight on what China is funding, where, with whom, to what effect. And actually, one of the things that I'm most excited about, the reports are great, I believe them, please read them, but we have a dashboard that we are making publicly available with a lot of the data points behind this research. And my hope is that you do see an uptick in future stories about these investments because the data is now publicly available. So that's part of it. I think another thing you mentioned, though, if politics is the focus for most journalists, what we don't really often talk about is that there's a connection between economics and politics.
Yes.
And that, economic dependence creates political leverage. And that is one of the real concerns, I think, with China's development finance, is how much do those dependencies sway political leaders' behavior in ways that align more closely with Beijing?
I want to say that both reports are publicly available. You can download them from the aiddata.org website. That's aiddata.org. And that also the dashboard, which I had a chance to play around with. It's terrific. It's also on the aiddata.org website. So if you want to know more about, so I'm talking to our audience here, if they want to know more about what went into the reports, it's transparent. But I also want to ask you, for some who are maybe favoring China this particular juncture in our Philippine history, they might say, well, you're a U.S. Research lab in a U.S. institution, and then you say yourself in the start, on the second page of your report that you received funding from the U.S. State Department. I know the reputation of William Mary, but can we talk about this? How is this a credible report for those who might be hostile to the findings?
They might be concerned about it. So first, I would say is that this is not the first time that we're looking at China's investments around the world. We have over a decade worth of research and experience doing this. And so it's a long-standing interest. And I think it dates back to a desire to have more data and more evidence in a conversation that is frankly very heated. There's much more opinion and rhetoric when it comes to understanding China's rise and China's investments than there is evidence. And so we wanted to be a course correction to that. And that's been a long-standing mission for the length of the time that I've been at AData. I think the second thing that I would say is that all of the methods that we use to collect and analyze this data are completely transparent and publicly available. You could replicate this, although it would be a lot of work. but it's designed so that you could replicate this. So people that are pro-China or that are China skeptics should be able to reproduce this. I think the third thing I would say is that we take our reputation as an independent research university very seriously, and so we accept funding partnerships from all manner of different places, so private foundations, multiple governments, international organizations. And I think just as I would say, it's good for the Philippines to diversify its funders, so too is it true for AData itself. And we have made an effort to do that because if we were completely financed by one funder, be it the U.S. government or somebody else, that reduces your autonomy, right? The last thing I will say, and it's a credit to the U.S. State Department that did fund this work. I only would ever accept a research assignment if the funder is clear that they can fund the interest in pursuing the question and producing the public data, but we hold the editorial pen, just in the same way that you here at Rappler, you guard your editorial independence, so do we.
So again, it's all in the data's there. Data is available to everyone. The reports are available to everyone. And also the research methodologies are there. One particular point about one of the research methodologies. Can you explain to me how did you classify newspaper articles and columns and opinion pieces as favorable to China and unfavorable? I mean, there's an entire section here on Manila Times being the most pro-China, and the numbers bear it. And I know many people who work there, but I agree. I mean, it confirms what I know by experience. But now you've quantified it. But I just want to know, how did you quantify it?
Yeah, I think so. For the sentiment analysis, we look at this article by article, sometimes line by line, and you're looking for terms around the use of China or so we looked at China as a term, and then we looked at the 10 most expensive development projects that are financed by China. And then you look at that in the context of the article or the line around it to assign a sentiment.
And did you make a distinction between news articles and opinion column?
Yeah, so in the base analysis primarily focused on news articles, but we did an extensive piece looking at op-eds in the Manila Times. And so when I talked about the positive sentiment in the Manila Times, it was a study of the op-eds in particular. But news articles, in theory, should be a little bit more objective and neutral.
That's right.
And so it's helpful to separate between the two.
That's right. We're running long. Let me just ask one last question. I had a chance to speak to you beforehand, and I talked to you about the relative stability of Philippine public opinion as far as asserting our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea are concerned. And I think I can add to that, I'm sure there is majority public opinion also in favor of banning the Philippine offshore gaming operators. Sure. Fairly or unfairly, they are lumped as China's doing. Right. My question is, if I am a development expert in China and I really want to fund a development project in the Philippines, is there a future that I can look forward to and say they will appreciate what we're doing? I mean, we can get a better coverage, given the ongoing dispute in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, and this current crisis involving illegal gaming. I know it's not within the scope of your report, but
so I think what the POGOs and the South China Sea disputes underscore to me is that when China is investing in financing for development here in the Philippines, it's not doing it in a vacuum. People haven't compartmentalized, I'm only thinking about China as a development financier. Because in reality, they're seeing the news articles about the POGOs, and there are many more articles about those than there are these infrastructure projects. They're also seeing the increasing tensions in the South China Sea and all of the news coverage around that. So I think because those are so visceral, they're seen as threatening to Philippine sovereignty, in the case of South China Sea, and then, having social repercussions in terms of the POGOs. I think that positions itself in the mind of people in a way that, it sticks in their memory. So I think if China wants to counterbalance that, it would need to make its development projects more memorable in people's minds, to really unpack what are the true benefits to these projects. And I think in this respect, China's reluctance to be transparent actually undercuts its ability to shape the narratives and the message. An example is the Kaliwa Dam
Okay. Yeah.
So this is a very controversial project in the Philippines. The only mentions that China talks about the Kaliwa Dam in all of its state-run media coverage is how this is a touchstone, an example of Philippine-China cooperation in a time of escalating tensions. There's no discussion of all of the controversy. And in a way, that's a missed opportunity to have a true conversation about how do you use these development projects to help the Philippine people. The other thing I'll say is, you take a controversial project like North Rail. That's non-existent in China's own media coverage. It doesn't talk about it at all. And I think this creates, it makes it seem less credible because China is not willing to discuss these things. But, I think also the fact that it's not talking about both the risks and the rewards of these projects is really problematic.
Maybe we should start thinking of establishing a Philippine footprint in the China media space. I have many more questions, but our time is up. Thank you very much, Samantha Custer, a data director of policy analysis. This has been a fascinating, enriching conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
And that's it for us today. The next step for engaged citizens, as always, is to take a more active part in our democracy. Download the Rappler Communities app to join the chat room of your choice. Thank you. This is John Nery. See you in the public square.